The Detroit River, buried history and the emergence of the gates, the resurfacing of ancient myth and lore. What if the Detroit River and the surrounding sacred landscapes were more unusual than previously believed, or we could have ever imagined? What if there were Native American legends describing this precise region as a gateway or a portal to the afterlife? Could local legends also reveal the existence of an ancient and otherworldly gatekeeper? What if the realm of the Gatekeeper had an exact location, a location described as a prophetic portal? What if the ancient and sacred landscapes described in the legends and the historical accounts had been buried, covered up, and even built over by ancient star forts and even the 1889 International World's Fair? Is it possible that similar gateway, portal, and otherworldly symbolism may be resurfacing in the form of art, architecture, hidden in plain sight? Could the symbol of the star or the pentagram be designed for the streets of Detroit? Can particular areas in Detroit function as consciousness portals, catalysts connecting us to the past, present, and even future? Treading through our ancient past, we will attempt to unbury this lost and possibly hidden knowledge, which appears to be resurfacing in the forms of art, architecture, and even cultural events. The Detroit River, Legends and Lore. The Detroit River flows southwesterly, acting as both a strait and an international border between the United States and Canada. The majestic body of water flows for approximately 28 miles, and it connects the northern Great Lakes, including Lake Michigan and Lake Superior and Lake Huron, with Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. The first inhabitants of this area along the river were the Native Americans, and at one time the ancient villages and sacred mound sites, they dotted this landscape on both sides of the waterway. This land along the river was considered sacred for several reasons. One reason was naturally in regards to the agriculture, but another was a little more unusual. This area was also considered to be a gateway between realms. And there are several legends as well as historical accounts that describe this otherworld scenario. One legend is Chief Sleeping Bear and the Keeper of the Gates. Ottawa mythology says that long ago Chief Sleeping Bear had a daughter who was so beautiful he kept her hidden in a covered boat tied up on the banks of what is now called the Detroit River. The chief hid his daughter to keep her from being ogled by mortal men, who he thought would be unable to handle seeing her beauty. One day, as the chief was bringing her food, the wind spirits caught a glimpse through the flaps of the covered boat, and were so taken by her beauty, they decided to whip up a storm in order to blow the cover off the boat and get a better view. They blew so hard, however, that it broke free of its mooring and went adrift down the river. The keeper of the water gate saw the drifting boat and rescued her. He was so enthralled by her beauty that he took her to his lodge. But the winds saw this and became angry, and they buffeted him so fiercely he was killed. The wind spirits guided the girl back to her father, Chief Sleeping Bear. They begged him not to hide her anymore, but instead placed her on an island in the river, where she would be safe from mortal men, but the spirits would be able to gaze upon her beauty. The chief agreed to this. He placed her on what is now Belle Isle, and blessed the Gitchi-Manitou to guard the isle with many snakes, so that men would not come there. The girl lived there and was happy that she had now a beautiful place to run free instead of being hidden. In fact, the snakes of the island were charmed by the girl's beauty and worshipped her. Gitchi-Manitou was impressed by this. He made the girl immortal to rule and dwell upon this isle forever. Later, when the white man came, he initially named the isle Rattlesnake Island. Her spirit is referred to as the snake goddess, and she is said to inhabit Belle Isle still as an apparition of the forest, sometimes as a white female doe deer. Anyway, the girl's would-be lover, the Deadwater Gatekeeper, was placed nearby in what was later known as the Isle Peach, or Peach Island. His spirit lived in solitude on this smaller island, and it is said that the braves who went there to this island for meditation would seek wisdom from his spirit before going to battle. His voice sounded like the wind in the trees and could only be understood by those who had fasted and observed proper meditation. The local Native Americans were very familiar and respectful of the realm of the Gatekeeper. In 1762, Chief Pontiac visited Peach Island after a foreboding that came in the form of an unusual weather occurrence. The unusual weather resulted in what has been called Detroit's Dark Day. On October 19, 1762, a darkness filled the sky, and shortly thereafter black rain fell to the ground. This extremely rare weather phenomenon scared early settlers, and it's argued that the Native American chief Pontiac may have seen it as a sign to start a war. Following this sign, Pontiac chose to visit Peace Island to seek counsel from the prophet of the Keeper of the Gates. While the water Gatekeeper may have occupied a consciousness portal, the gateway to the afterlife was located just downriver. Dwarfing all other burial mounds in the vicinity was the massive Great Mound on the River Rouge, located in what is now Detroit's Delray neighborhood. It was estimated that it originally measured 200 feet wide by 300 feet long, covering more than an acre and standing 40 feet tall, but it may have been much larger at one point. The significance of the Great Mound was it was considered a portal to the afterlife. Thousands of bodies found their final resting place within this mound. Every so many years, this sacred mound would be the location for the Huron Feast of the Dead. The Huron Feast of the Dead was a mortuary custom of the Wyandot people, which involved the disinterment of the deceased relatives from their initial individual graves, followed by the reburial in a final communal grave. A time for both mourning and celebration, the custom became spiritually and culturally significant. This location here at the Great Mound became known around the region to many tribes as a gateway between realms, between life and death, the past, the present, and, well, possibly the future. Detroit Star Forts. The first mention of the Native American sacred landscapes along the river come from the French missionaries in the 1600s. These missionaries claimed to have found a large stone idol on Belle Isle venerated by the locals. They destroyed the guardian idol with axes and they threw it into the river. This would be the beginning and a foreseeing of the destruction of the ancient land to come. In 1701, French explorer Antoine Cadillac and his crew entered the straits of the river looking for the perfect location to bring into fruition the new city of Detroit. The perfect location was a piece of real estate situated along the riverbanks in the heart of the Native American landscape. Cadillac and his men moved ashore, creating the first permanent structure, Fort Pontchartrain, also known as Fort Detroit. Fort Detroit would take on the shape of a star, also known as a star fort. This would be one of the first of many times that the symbol of the star would be stamped upon the landscape along the Detroit River. The British eventually would take over Fort Detroit. British commanders felt that several hundred yards to the north and on higher ground would make a more suitable location for their new fort. Like the French before, the British built a new star-shaped fort in the heart of Detroit, this one being called Fort Shelby. 1796, they decided to abandon the fort and move operations to the opposite side of the river. In keeping with the theme, another star fort was constructed called Fort Maldine. And according to our timeline, this would be the third star fort built upon this ancient and sacred landscape. Following Fort Maldine's decommission from the years 1859 to 1875, the fort would be renovated into an insane asylum. Fort Maldine was one of many examples where prior ordinance lands were repurposed by the order of the province to become asylums, hospitals, sometimes prisons, as these prior forts already possessed in many cases fortified buildings and defenses suitable for these institutional facilities. Back on the American side, the Americans, the fourth and final stellar fort would be erected. And this would be erected at the junction of the Detroit River and the River Rouge. This was also the location of the Great Mound and other ancient earthen structures. Fort Wayne was built directly over, once again, an ancient American sacred landscape. The precise land that the Star Fort would be built upon was both an ancient burial site as well as a ceremonial site. During excavations, Native American bones were actually discovered in the earthen walls used to create the Star Fort. All that was to remain of the past was one small mound on the outskirts of the fort, and the remnants of what was left of the Great Mound. Detroit International Exposition, 1889. All that remained of Detroit's ancient past were a few remnants of what had once been known as the Great Mound. In the late 1800s, much of the mound was plundered for relics and used as building materials. Sand from the ancient structure was being sold for 2.5 cents per barrel and used as building materials for the newly forming town. It was estimated that over 1,300 of the ancient skeletons were discovered and dumped into the river during this desecration process. It was rumored that many of the skeletons were of abnormal size, some having perforated or trepanned skulls. The very last remnants disappeared alongside the 1889 Detroit International Exposition. Exposition attendees were encouraged to dig into the mound for souvenirs of a forgotten past for 25 cents. What remained was used to coat the pathways of the exposition in hopes of keeping the dust down to a minimum. At the same time history was being buried, a new future narrative was being presented. In 1889, the Detroit International Exposition would kick off. Why was the exposition built neighboring a star fort and atop an ancient burial ground? Howdy Mikowski points out in his book, Expeditions Exposed. In the majority of instances, ancient fairs were established in connection with religious festivals, and hence were established some places of worship, or some sacred spot. This appears to be the precise scenario that has taken place in Detroit. A modern exposition utilizes the real estate held sacred for thousands of years by the local Native Americans. Well, the story goes that in the spring of 1889, a small army of laborers moved in to drain the marshes and clear the, quote, farmland. Contractors soon followed, laying down train tracks, building docks, ponds, and landscaping in preparation for some of the largest buildings the world had ever seen at that point. From the time they began clearing the, quote, swamp to the point of grand opening took only 5 months according to official records. The complete transformation of the area in just 5 months almost seemed inconceivable and prompted one fairgoer, a Frenchman from Ecorse, to exclaim, "My God, look at that! I shot a duck in the marsh here last spring." The main exhibit building and several others sprang from the drawings of local architect Louis Camper. The main building had a frontage of nearly 500 feet, a 20-story main tower, 4 corner towers, and 5 acres of glass, boasted 200,000 square feet of exhibition space. The towers were a resounding hit. This would be the first opportunity ordinary folks would be able to gain the bird's eye view perspective of their surroundings. So from the tops of the towers, experiencers would have been able to see for vast distances. Looking northernly, they would have seen the magnificent sight of Fort Wayne Star Fort, with Belle Isle in the distance. Southerly would have been the looking over the very last remnants of the Great Mound, with the backdrop of the majestic Detroit River and her many ships. There were many unusual and groundbreaking and sometimes disturbing exhibits and events taking place during the exposition. The following details are from a book, Detroitland by Richard Bach. Professor J.C. Chambers, he invited fairgoers to drop in at the Electric Sanitarium and Institute for a free treatment. The professor, whose advertisement cited no credentials beyond noting that he had, quote, spent 1/4 of a century relieving suffering of humanity, he employed patented apparatus whereby the galvanic, magnetic, and electric-induced currents are quickly infused all through the system. This, he exclaimed, enabled him to cure such varied and chronic cases as brain exhaustion, kidney troubles, memory loss, headaches, impotence, back pain, amongst many other ailments. Another crowd favorite was Professor C. Bartholomew. The crowd arched their necks as the seemingly suicidal balloonist and parachutist performed trapeze tricks while ascending into the overcast sky in his hot air balloon. When he reached an altitude of 9,000 feet, he climbed out of the basket and jumped into the clouds. The professor missed the exposition grounds completely, but landed without mishap on the outskirts of Windsor. He said, "I have looked down upon a great many cities, but have never seen a prettier city than Detroit. To fully appreciate its beauty, one must look at it from the elevation that will enable them to see it all at one time." Detroit's big show ended with a bang when a battery of cannon punctuated a martial tune that final afternoon. The ground-shaking explosions caused people in the main building to come tumbling out the doors. Most thought the roof or a tower had given way. That's one way to go out with a bang. The International Exposition would continue annually for a couple more years before permanently shutting down and demolishing the fairgrounds. When all was said and done, the monumental architecture was gone, as were the last remnants of the Great Mound. Over the years, this land would become industrialized and polluted, leaving only memories of a strange and ancient past. The resurfacing of the gates. In one aspect, the destruction of the Great Mound was a symbolic closing of the, quote, gateway to the afterlife. Although the symbolic gateway may have been previously closed, others may have attempted to open throughout Detroit's timeline. Is it possible that gateway and portal symbolism could have resurfaced in the streets of Detroit in the forms and shapes of art and architecture? It appears as a symbol of the five-pointed star and or the pentagram had been destined for the streets of Detroit. The same time the star forts were being built, the modern city layout was being designed. Thomas Jefferson sent his disciple Augustus Woodward to town following the Great Fire of 1805. Woodward was chosen as a committee of one to lay out New Detroit. It has been said that Augustus Woodward hoped to live up to the New Detroit motto, "We hope for better things, it shall rise again from the ashes." The Detroit motto appears to be an obvious Phoenix reference, proposing a rebirth for the city of Detroit. Woodward, being an acquaintance of Charles L'Enfant, the D.C. city planner, utilized the same symbolism as was incorporated in the Capitol. Most noticeably were the pentagram and Freemasonic scale. The symbol of the pentagram and the pentagon would emerge once again in 2003 in the form of a new building built as the CompuWare headquarters. In the heart of Augustus Woodward's pentagram street layout is located Campus Martius, or Mars. Here resurfaced the same pentagon, symbolic in the form of a new building. The heart of the new Pentagon building was a pentagonal glass pyramid as a skylight that illuminated a hanging sculpture of a rainbow bridge below. And by the way, that pentagonal glass pyramid in Campus Martius, or Mars, is identical to images of a pentagonal pyramid on Mars. Hart Plaza and the gateway to Orion. Viewing the blueprint and the aerial images of Hart Plaza, what you recognize is that several pieces of the architecture in Hart Plaza are aligned and correlated possibly to the Giza pyramids and Sphinx. Symbolically, Hart Plaza's amphitheater, the fountain, and pyramid align precisely with the ancient Egyptian pyramids. The path or the causeway leading from the Pyramid of Khafre to the Sphinx in Egypt is also very similar to Detroit's Dodge Fountain and the path leading to the Egyptian-styled obelisk, or pylon, and pylons many times mark the entrances, of course, to Egyptian temples. Now, regarding the layout of the Giza Plateau, a relatively well-known theory is Robert Bauval's Orion correlation theory. He believes, and has rather successfully demonstrated, that the three main pyramids at Giza may have been aligned with the belt stars of the constellation of Orion. This leads to the question, could Detroit's Hart Plaza be aligned with both the Giza pyramids and the stars, creating a symbolic gateway to Orion? And if so, why? In 2001, Detroit held its tricentennial celebrations and began a new restoration of the riverfront. It would be known as the, quote, Gateway Vision. As part of the Gateway Vision, there was a contest to see what kind of sculpture would fit in Hart Plaza's Orion Gateway. And the winner was a local artist named David Barr. He created the transcending gateway that now graces the entrance to the plaza. And of course, the Horse and Sun Fountain, which sits in the heart of Hart Plaza, received a brand new plaque for the Gateway Vision, and this plaque pointed out that the Horse and Sun Fountain is an engine of water at the gateway to a great city. Once again, referring to Hart Plaza as a gateway. Now, the tricentennial gateway vision would not have been complete without a new sculpture to occupy the riverfront in the rear of Hart Plaza, the Gateway to Freedom. That's the actual name, the Gateway to Freedom, and this is a memorial to the Underground Railroad. So, was the ancient gateway symbolism destined for the modern sacred landscape? Has the veil always been a little thinner along the banks of the Detroit River? Starforts, pentagrams, portals, and gateways? So at the same time the emergence of the gates was taking place within the campus Mars/Hart Plaza corridor, a similar scenario is taking place on the sacred Belle Isle, the realm of the snake goddess, in the Gatekeeper. Belle Isle and neighboring Pisau were once home to the ancient legends of the Gatekeeper and Chief Sleeping Bear's daughter's spirit, referred to as the snake goddess. And although she was immortalized in some legends as a white doe, she was called the snake goddess due to the rattlesnakes that were said to surround her and the island as a form of protection put in place by Chief Sleeping Bear. Over the years, those legends would be somewhat forgotten as the building of a modern-day culture would begin to rise from the ashes. The question is, could any of the ancient legends, archetypes, or possibly symbols resurface in the future in the forms of art and architecture? When it comes to the architecture, there were a few commonalities in regards to the buildings and monuments that would spring up on the island for decades. The two symbolic representations you seem to see the most on the island are the arch and the obelisk. Many, if not all of the buildings, are littered with arches surrounding their windows, doors, and entranceways. The other symbol, the obelisk, can be found on light poles, bridges, and taken on the shape of a Caroline Tower and even the lighthouses. Now granted, some will point out this is just an architectural style, and it is, but could there be more to it than meets the eye? What if the conjunction of arches and obelisks could create a symbolic gateway? It is believed by many esoteric architects from the ancient past as well as the present that these two symbols do create a balance. The symbol of the arch is that of the divine feminine, and the obelisk representative of the male energies. This balancing of the male and the female is also believed to be a catalyst for a symbolic gateway. One wonderful example of this exact scenario can be found in St. Louis at the Gateway Arch. What many are unaware of is that Earl Saarinen, the architect, purposely incorporated the symbolic duo into one of the largest monuments in America. He's pointed out that he designed the arch to represent symbolically both the male and the female energies, and accomplished this by designing the arch that appears as an obelisk from the sides. He literally incorporated the symbol of the arch and the obelisk to create an enormous symbolic gateway. Now back to Belle Isle, let's take a pictorial journey around the island to see what has emerged over the years. And we will start by crossing the Belle Isle Bridge. And what you'll notice about the Belle Isle Bridge is that it starts and ends with obelisks with many arches in between. Another two staples of the island are the Anna Scripps Whitcomb Conservancy as well as the aquarium. The conservancy was actually modeled after the Crystal Palace in London. Albert Kahn had a hand in designing both of the buildings, the aquarium and the conservancy. And the remainder of the structures on the island are very similar to these two, and they are chock full of arches, but due to space we will move on and look at a couple of the obelisk structures. The Nancy Brown Peace Carillon was one of several monuments where the tower structure could symbolically be compared to an obelisk. The Nancy Brown Peace Carillon is an octagonal in a cross-sectional shape. It's 98 feet in height and it's located right near the band shell on Belle Isle. Now on the northerly tip of the island is another symbolic obelisk which emerged in the form of a lighthouse. Designed by famed Detroit architect, once again, Albert Kahn, the Livingston Memorial Lighthouse has illuminated the way for passing ships for decades. This is the only marble lighthouse in the world. Now, Albert Kahn has pointed out he had the concept of an obelisk in mind when he created this Art Deco piece that would illuminate the Detroit River shores. Now, in conjunction with the arches and the obelisks emerged a new fountain that seemed very reminiscent of ancient times. You could even say that it has somewhat of an Atlantean feel. The Scott Memorial Fountain is considered the, quote, jewel of Belle Isle and was designed by Cass Gilbert. Now, although we're just scratching the surface, the question becomes, could this building and reoccurring symbolism over the years be pointing towards something to come? Could this sacred landscape along and on the Detroit River be destined to be a gateway or even a portal? And could the resurfacing of ancient symbolism arise in art and architecture? Well, as mentioned previously, the symbols of the arches and obelisks many times are a catalyst for a symbolic gateway. This appears to have been the case once again on the northerly tip of Belle Isle, right in front of the marble lighthouse. Just recently, a brand new gateway sculpture emerged called One World Under Michigan Stars. And this new monument was created by Detroit artists and brothers Eric and Israel Norden of the Detroit Design Center. And from the plaque, it reads, "The Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Gateway welcomes the world to explore the beauty of Michigan and the Iron Bell Trail. This trail runs between the northern Gateway in Ironwood and the southern Gateway on Belle Isle here in Detroit. 2,000 miles of outdoors that can be explored by everyone. The sculpture is inspired by a topographical view and skyline of the two cities, turned vertically and facing one another. The extract shapes create a trail in the sky between them. The hand-cast blue glass symbolizes the water that is so precious. Well, we recently looked at all the star and pentagram symbolism that seemed destined for Detroit. And now a new gateway has emerged called One World Under Michigan Stars. Strange. We just looked at the bearing of history under Michigan stars. And this same gateway is literally overlooking the realm of the ancient Gatekeeper of legend and lore. So, concluding in the same way we began, what if the Detroit River and the surrounding sacred landscapes were more unusual than previously believed or we could have ever imagined? What if there were Native American legends describing this precise region as a gateway or portal to the afterlife? Could local legends also reveal the existence of an ancient and otherworldly gatekeeper? What if the realm of the gatekeeper had an exact location described as a prophetic portal? And what if the ancient and sacred landscapes described in legends and historical accounts had been buried and covered up and built over by starforts in an international fair? Is it possible that this similar gateway, portal, and otherworldly symbolism may have resurfaced in the forms of art and architecture hidden in plain sight? Could the symbol of the star or pentagram been destined for the streets of Detroit? And can particular areas in Detroit function as consciousness portals, catalysts, connecting us to the past, the present, and the future? Only time will tell.